So if you guys remember from Wednesday, we did this very first building block of culture, and we talked about our little iceberg of culture, so our visible and hidden layers. And we're going to go ahead and finish this chapter 2 PowerPoint off today, talking about the rest of the building blocks and the barriers. And guys, please, please, please remember to go and do your readings as well, because you do have those. They are in your modules. Because I don't know if you guys saw the announcement that I posted, we will be doing on Monday our week 2 discussion from the other readings on Monday. And we will also be doing just a quick review of chapters 1 and 2. We do not have a test over chapters 1 and 2, but I just want to do a review and make sure that, you know, we're all where we're kind of supposed to be, and you guys are picking up what I'm putting down. So any questions before we go ahead and get started with this? Okay, well, if you ever do, feel free to pop into the chat or unmute yourself and just start talking. So we are continuing on with our second building block of intercultural communication, which is communication. So this is saying, you know, communication is a symbolic process whereby meaning is shared and negotiated. So communication being symbolic means, you know, our words don't have meaning until we assign it meaning. So they're only significant because people agree on what they mean. So if we hadn't agreed, you know, that waving hi to someone means hello, if we waved at someone, they'd be like, okay. And same in other cultures. Like if you nod your head yes here in the US, you are saying yes. But in other cultures, this means no. And if you don't agree on that meaning, you know, someone's going to be asking you, hey, can you do something? And you're going to be like, yeah. And they're going to be like, why are they saying yes, but shaking their head no, or nodding their head no, I guess. We use words and symbols, and we assume that the other person shares that ability too as well. And if they don't, obviously, then, you know, they don't speak the same language as us, or, you know, they're just not understanding, and we have miscommunications. Communication is a process. So you have people who are communicating. So you have different people in a communication interaction. So you have your sender, your receiver, and people who are doing both simultaneously. You have a message that you are sending, so what you're actually saying. You have the channel in which it's said, whether that be a digital channel like we are today, whether it be a verbal channel, you know, a telephone call, Zoom, Instagram, Facebook. Those are all different channels or ways to send messages. You have noise that could be affecting the communication. So like if someone has a really strong accent, that could be noise. If there's physical noise going around, like if there's a jackhammer or cars passing, that can be noise. If you woke up on the wrong side of the bed or aren't feeling good, that could be noise. You know, if you're too hot or too cold, that could be noise. That's affecting the communication interaction. And then of course you have the context in which it takes place. So what's actually going on in the context? Like, are you at school? Are you at home? What type of cultures are involved? Is it just one? Is it two? Is it, you know, more than 10? So what's the context? You have to share and negotiate meaning. So you have to agree on the meaning in order to be able to pass it between people. Because if you guys don't speak the same language, then you're not going to be communicating verbally. You're going to have to communicate through pictures or body language on which you can agree on the meaning of. Messages can have more than one meaning, you know, just like words can have more than one meaning. And we tend to just kind of assume that the other person understands what we're saying, even though they might not. So sometimes it's good to just go and check in and saying, hey, can you tell me what you're understanding from this? Like, what are you getting from this? Just to make sure that I'm communicating it in the correct way. Because if you don't, then that can definitely lead to misunderstandings. So you just have to try and check in and make sure that you are communicating what you need to be and that the other person is understanding it in the way that it needs to be understood. It's dynamic, so it's always ongoing, it's changing. We're simultaneously taking in all sorts of information, which is affecting how we perceive the situation and how we're communicating with the other person. It doesn't have to be intentional. So a lot of communication occurs without us specifically meaning to send it. So just in your body language, your tone of voice, like a micro expression on your face, can communicate things that you may not be intending it to. And then communication is receiver orientated, which means that the person who assigns the meaning determines the outcome of the communication situation. So if your communication partner assigns a negative meaning to what you said, even though you didn't mean it that way, then they are determining the outcome of it, of saying, you just insulted me in some way. So, this business, partnership's not going to go anywhere. And that will, of course, influence, that business decision and any other future interactions that you may have with them. And sorry, I feel like a sneeze coming on. So if I had a bad look on my face, like I'm going to sneeze. And it's receiver oriented. So just understand that there will be miscommunications and misinterpretations. So you have to be prepared for that and say, okay, I need to be aware that this is going to happen. So what kind of questions can I ask to make sure that I can clarify what I mean? So any questions about that? Okay. No questions, then I will move on to culture and communication. So this is a decent little size section, but obviously, like we've talked about, our culture influences our communication. So our worldview is our particular way of looking at the world. So everyone has a different worldview because everyone's personality is different. Everyone was raised differently, but our values help shape our worldview. So the values of a group represent some of what their worldview is, based on their values that they have. And of course, our values are what is judged to be good or bad or right or wrong. So if you have a value on family, you probably think it's good to help and take care of your family. If you value financial security and financial gain, then you probably think it's good and right to, be financially successful and financially secure and have money. So we have, what is this, 4 or 5? I think it's 4 value dimensions that we are going to talk about. And then you might read about a couple more in the readings. I'm not sure if that's like this week or next week, maybe. I think you get to read a little more about them. So I'm just kind of going to go over them pretty quickly. Power distance. So power distance is concerned to which the extent that we will accept unequal distribution of power. So the US is low power distance. So we don't tend to accept, super high power distances or hierarchies, right? So low power distance would say that you guys, in class, your students, I'm the professor, you guys feel free to come in and ask questions and ask for clarification. And if you don't understand something, like interrupt the class and say, hey, can you re-explain this? Because we're not as concerned with who has the power or not. But in other cultures, like Russia, China, Japan, they have a higher power distance. They're high power distance cultures, where like if you are in a classroom in China, you do not interrupt your teacher. You don't ask questions. You know, you might get a chance to ask questions at the end, but you're not going to disrupt the middle of class to ask questions. So there's that stricter hierarchy in that high power distance culture. But here in the US, we are a low power distance culture where we still have a hierarchy, but it's less strict. You have your masculine, feminine dimensions. So it's the degree to which gender roles are valued and the emphasis placed on masculine, quote unquote, and feminine, quote unquote, values. So Japan, Austria, Mexico, places like that tend to value a more masculine orientation. So more preference for gender specific roles. You kind of see that in like the machismo culture in Mexico, and then Northern Europe. So like places like Finland, Scandinavia, are a more feminine value orientation. So more gender equality and, you know, quality of life for everyone, no matter your gender. And, you know, once again, I think I've said this the other day, but this is not to say that any of these cultures are right or wrong. You know, just because a culture has a more masculine or more feminine, or has a higher or lower power distance, or is more uncertainty avoidant or less, does not mean that any of the cultures are bad or worse than any others. It just means that they are different. They have different historical experiences that lead them to act in a certain way. So uncertainty avoidant, so the degree to which people feel threatened by ambiguous or uncertain situations. And then if they're more uncertainty avoidant and want to avoid that ambiguity, then they will establish more structure or more rules. So low uncertainty avoidance, so US, we like new experiences. Great Britain, Sweden, Ireland, Hong Kong, a lot of like the big multicultural places tend to have low uncertainty avoidance. So they want new experiences, they have fewer rules, so less of that rule structure. They accept more dissent, so like political dissent or just differing opinions in general, and are more comfortable taking risks. So Americans would be more likely than someone from Japan on average to take more risks, or to like try new foods, or to be in more uncertain situations like traveling around the world. But cultures with higher uncertainty avoidance, so they want more structure, they want more rules, they want less ambiguity, are places like Greece, Portugal, Japan, probably Russia. But they have more extensive rules, more regulations, they're more organized, more structured. They seek more consensus about goals, less risk taking in regards to situations like that. And then we have our long-term versus short-term orientation. So this is concerned with virtue versus truth. So virtue is that long-term orientation, and short-term is truth, and we're in a more short-term orientated culture. So United States, Canada, places like that, where their truth, you know, possessing the truth rather than virtue. I'm looking for quick results in endeavor. So the US, we have a lot of like get rich quick schemes. So that's our short-term orientation. We're not thinking of the long term of like, well, if I invest or if I work hard at my job, then eventually I'll get, it's like, no, I want to get rich quick. I want to keep up with the Joneses, exerting social pressure to conform. So that's like that keeping up with the Joneses. And then that long-term orientation, so more on virtue, so thrift, perseverance, saving your money for the future, tenacity, so sticking things out and not giving up, you know, if it sucks in the short term, but knowing that, you know, over a longer time that, you know, it'll be more beneficial. So does that make sense so far? Any questions from these value dimensions? And like I said, just going over it real quick, because I think you guys will be reading about this in one of your readings as well. Okay. So moving on to context. So what situations are these communications occurring? So what physical situation are you in? Well, right now I'm in my office. You guys are probably all in your own houses or dorm rooms or maybe in the library. What social setting is this in? What political system are we in, and how is that affecting how we communicate with different people? Like if I know someone's political affiliation, am I going to communicate with them differently now than I would have 6 months ago, because we have changed presidents and changed the political climate in this country? What kind of historical structures are influencing our interaction? So how does history influence the context of what we're doing? So that could be historical legacies, slavery, you know, the Irish immigrants when Americans discriminated against them, or when people discriminate against the Chinese immigrants or the Italian immigrants, or insert whatever here. How does that history affect how we interact with people? So yeah, context is pretty much there. We're always involved in some form of contextual something. So it's kind of interesting to see how these change how we talk to people or talk about issues. So power. So power is always present. It's always there. And like I said earlier, the US, we don't have as strict as a hierarchy. We have lower power distance, but it's still there. Power is still present. And power changes depending on the context. So in some contexts, certain people will have more power, quote unquote, than other people. So if your friend comes to visit you here in Thatcher, Arizona, and they're from insert other place here, Tennessee, you know, you have more power right then in that relationship and that communication interaction because you're from here, you're on your home turf. And if you went over to Tennessee, that power would reverse. They would then have that advantage, that power within the communication context. So power is very rarely equal. Someone typically has a quote unquote, you know, leg up over someone else in power or privilege or prestige. The groups with the most power determine mostly how the communication system is for the entire society or the entire area. And, you know, how do we get our power? Power is complex. It comes from different things, different ways. So we can have power that we have gotten from involuntary groups, so groups that we don't choose. So you might have power or lack of power based on race, gender, ethnicity, the language that you speak natively. So those things are more permanent in nature. It's hard to change those involuntary groups that help influence our ability to access power. And then you have your voluntary membership in groups. They're more changeable, and you know, you can gain or lose power based on that. So I am in a voluntary group of professors because that's the career I have chosen for myself, and therefore that gives me a certain amount of power in a certain context. In a classroom, yes. At Walmart, no. So we have to think about power in regards to communication especially intercultural communication, because, you know, who has the power in which context, or who has more power and who has less, and how do we maybe share it if necessary. So it's dynamic, like I said, it's changing. We can negotiate power, exchange it. Thoughts on those building blocks of communication before we move on to the barriers to effective intercultural communication? So we have culture, communication, context, and power as our building blocks. And then our barriers, of course, are going to be the negative things that prevent us from being effective communicators. And I'm going to start off by saying having some ethnocentrism and stereotypes, it's a natural brain shortcut that we do. It's easy for our brain to think in generalizations. So we all have some, you know, on a spectrum, we are all somewhere on the ethnocentric spectrum. And stereotypes, we all have stereotypes, and they're natural, and they don't have to be negative or destructive to your communication, but they definitely can be. So the first barrier is ethnocentrism. So like I said, it's kind of on a spectrum. You know, you can have that little bit of belief that your culture is great, it's awesome, versus it being very extreme where you're saying like, oh, well, every other culture sucks, it's not as good as we are, you know, no matter what kind of values they have or what kind of things that they do, you know, they're not, you know, worthy to be part of, you know, our society, because, you know, just as a whole, insert whatever culture here, you know, we are the best. So it can become a barrier when it prevents people from seeing someone else's point of view. So when you're unable to try to understand other people or see where they're coming from and try to understand them, then that's when ethnocentrism becomes that barrier, becomes that negative trait. But we all have a little bit of it, and it can be hard to see because, like, you know, most of the time we are probably within our own culture around other people who have similar beliefs that we do. So if we want to see our own ethnocentrism, then, you know, we need to get out, we need to travel, we need to talk to other people and try to understand where they're coming from. So stereotyping. So stereotypes are widely held beliefs about a group of people. They are a form of generalization, so a way of categorizing and processing information. Like I said, they are pretty natural, like our brains just automatically group things together. So they automatically generalize. It's okay, it happens. It's literally just part of our everyday thought process. But they can become detrimental. So they can be positive or negative. So you might have a positive stereotype that, oh, well, all Asians are smart, or a negative stereotype like, oh, all blonde people are dumb. Obviously, they're not true. Like, not all blonde people are dumb. Not all people from Asia are smart. And, you know, Asia itself is like a huge country. Like, are you including like Laos in there, Bhutan, China, Japan, Indonesia? Like, which part of Asia? But why do we have them? So they help to let us know kind of what to expect from other people and how to react. But obviously, like, stereotypes are just generalizations. So not everyone we meet from Indonesia is going to act like that stereotype we might have of Asian people. They can develop just naturally based on what we see in the media. or they can develop out of negative experience. Like if we have one negative experience with someone from Canada, then we can say, okay, well, the stereotype that all Canadians are nice is not true, because every Canadian I've met has been, you know, kind of a butthead. And people tend to remember information that supports stereotypes rather than information that contradicts it. So they're hard to kind of discard, because your brain has that confirmation bias of, well, no, you know, this other Canadian was also mean, rather than the 6 Canadians you met who were nice. So we have to really work at rejecting them and saying, no, I've been shown evidence to prove the contrary of whatever my stereotype is. So, and we learn our stereotypes from different ways. We learn it from the media. So the media portrays certain groups of people in certain ways because, you know, those are the tropes. That's kind of what sells. If you watch European movies and stuff like that, then, you know, you have the stereotype of the fat American tourist who doesn't really know what they're doing. If you've ever seen In Bruges, that's kind of a good example of that. It has a lot of cussing though, so I'm not going to play it for you guys, but you're welcome to seek that out if you so wish. But if you look at like American stereotypes, like if we look at action films, who are typically like the villains? Who are typically like the heroes? You know, are women presented a certain way in American film? Are men presented a certain way in American film? You know, are all children evil in American films? Yes. Or maybe not. I don't know. I don't watch a lot of American films. But, you know, the media is a huge way. Our family also teaches us stereotypes. So like if one of our parents or family members has had a negative experience with a certain group of people, then they can pass those stereotypes and generalizations on to us. So we just have to learn to recognize if we have a negative stereotype and say, you know, this is not 100% accurate. And then as we talk to more people from different places, we get individual information from them. We get to know them as people, and we can say, okay, this person is not a stereotype, this person's not, this person's not. So therefore, chances are that entire culture is probably not a stereotype. Okay. Moving on to prejudice. Let me just check the time. We are good on time. But prejudice is a negative attitude toward a cultural group based on little to no experience. So stereotypes tell us what the group is like, and prejudice tells us how to feel about that group. Yeah. But it does fill social functions, so the adjustment function. So we want to be liked by members of our own cultural groups, so we might have to reject other people in order to try to fit in with our own. Ego defense, so we may have certain prejudices because we don't want to admit certain things about ourselves. So, you know, taking out things that we feel about ourselves on other groups. Or value expressive, so we might hold prejudice because they help reinforce certain beliefs or values for ourselves. So tokenism is a type of prejudice, but there's also like blatant prejudice of like, you know, you can't sit with us, which is not very common anymore. But the tokenism, so you kind of go out of your way to engage in like really superficial, unimportant interactions with people of that specific group that you might be prejudiced against. But it's really superficial, even if it is positive. And I'm saying a you as in a general you, not as in like someone specific. I guess I could say a person might rather than just you. But so colorblind approach may be a very subtle form of prejudice that people can take, and it can be detrimental because it's not possible to quote unquote be colorblind. because that is something we notice. Like we notice that about people if they're a different ethnicity or a different race, or if they're from a different country. And it could be negating or pushing to the side really important aspects of people's identities. Like if you have a really important aspect of your identity, you don't want it to be pushed aside and say, oh, well, that doesn't matter. Like, you know, it's okay. Like I don't see, you know, insert whatever here. I don't see color. I don't see religion. You know, I'm colorblind, or, you know, sexuality blind or whatever. Because if that's an important part of someone's identity, you know, it doesn't feel good when you have that part of your identity pushed to the side. It can discourage meaningful conversation about relations between the different groups. If you say, oh, well, we're just not going to talk about it, you know, it's not a thing or whatever, then you're shutting down that conversation, or a person could be shutting down that conversation. And it can allow people, like I said, you know, go into that blind approach of, oh, it's, you know, it's fine. We don't see insert whatever thing here, and allow them to ignore, deny, disregard issues, and then help support a status quo. Making sense so far? And then discrimination. So it is the behaviors that result from stereotyping or prejudice. So that could be part of the thing of like, oh, well, you can't sit with us, you know, going out of your way to avoid people of a specific insert whatever here, people distancing themselves from other groups. Any of that could be discrimination. So any ism you can discriminate basically against. But you have to have power in order to discriminate. If you don't have the power to actually do it, or to actually, you know, exclude the people or avoid them, then it's not really discrimination. It has to go, you have to have the power or the ability to actually do something. So it could be really subtle, or it could be very overt. It could be personal, like the you can't sit with us example. You know, you're not wearing pink on Wednesday, you can't sit with us. Or it could be saying like, this is systematic, you know, we don't hire this particular type of people for jobs. You know, it could be genocide. We've had, I'm trying to think, we had the one in Rwanda, Kosovo. I mean, I guess that was like 20 years ago or so, maybe 30 years was Rwanda. I'm trying to think of, oh yeah, the genocide going on like right now in China, with the Muslims living in China. Basically genocide, systematic elimination if you are forcibly sterilizing women of a specific group so that they cannot reproduce and pass on their culture and their beliefs. And then hate speech is also included under this. So this is not, at least the incitement of violence is not included under free speech. So you can say what you want, but that doesn't mean it's protected under free speech, especially incitements of violence. So if your hate speech is inciting violence or action against another person or group of people based on that group membership of, oh, well, we got to get rid of all the people with glasses because they're evil, or we got to, we got to go and do whatever to take out this particular group membership. If it's inciting violence or action, then it is not protected by free speech. But yeah, we talked about that interpersonal, collective, or institutional. So between people, in societies, institutions, nations. So how are we going to build our intercultural skills for this, though? So how do we build better building blocks and help break down those barriers if we have any. So, be conscious of, what kind of groups we belong to, both voluntary and involuntary. So what kind of groups have you voluntarily put yourself into versus what kind of groups have you been born into? What kind of power or advantage might that give you? What kind of communication are you using in intercultural encounters? Are you trying to understand? Are you going in saying, okay, there is the possibility for misunderstanding, so what can I do to make sure that I do the best I can to get my point across? Understand how diverse your friends are. So can you make more friends with more types of people? Have you tried that? Maybe your friend group is really, really diverse already. Become more knowledgeable about different cultures. You guys are already in this class, so you're already like on that step, like you're on the step for all of these, because you are going out of your way to learn about, how to interact with people from different cultures, and also probably to get your intensive writing requirement out of the way. Notice how different groups are portrayed in the media. So if you watch American films, how are different groups of people portrayed? If you watch Bollywood films, how are different groups of people portrayed? If you watch European or Chinese or Indonesian or Nigerian films, how are different groups portrayed? Try not to generalize when you're speaking with people, especially people of other cultures. And then, if people are telling racist jokes, that might be something where you step up and say, hey, like, are you sure that you want to be doing that? Is that okay? Like, that's kind of being a butthead towards, this other group. So, any questions from chapter 2? Like I said, I know we went over it kind of quickly, but you will get a lot of this stuff in your readings from this week and next week, or this week and last week.